are you really about to ruin my life because you think I look guilty?
Ma'am, shut your mouth, because if you fight this, I'll make sure you don't walk out of here free.
The fluorescent lights of Terminal C cast harsh shadows across the security checkpoint as two voices cut through the chaos of a busy Thursday afternoon. Voices that would soon expose one of the most calculated acts of corruption ever caught on camera. Are you really about to ruin my life because you think I look guilty? The voice belonged to a woman whose military bearing couldn't hide the tremor of disbelief coursing through her words. The response came swift and cold. Ma'am, shut your mouth, because if you fight this, I'll make sure you don't walk out of here free. What followed was a cascade of moments that would unravel faster than anyone could have anticipated. Shaky body camera footage capturing hands that moved with practiced deception, the metallic glint of evidence that materialized from nowhere, a teenager's whispered confession that would change everything, airport lights strobing red and blue as sirens wailed, TSA agents shouting commands over the din of confused travelers, and finally, a CCTV freeze frame that would become the smoking gun in a federal courthouse. This is the story of Sergeant Alana Brooks, a decorated black veteran whose journey home became a nightmare of institutional betrayal. This is the story of Officer Travis Keene, a man whose badge became a weapon of racial targeting. This is the story of a bag that wasn't hers, a plant that backfired, and one 15-year-old witness whose courage toppled a corrupt system built on assumptions and power. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further. Denver International Airport hummed with the particular tension that accompanies heightened security alerts, the kind of atmospheric pressure that makes travelers move a little faster, speak a little quieter, and submit a little more readily to authority. The Department of Homeland Security had issued warnings about increased drug trafficking through major transportation hubs, and the ripple effects were visible in every corner of the terminal. Additional K-9 units prowling between gates, TSA agents conducting more thorough searches, and an increased police presence that transformed routine travel into something resembling a checkpoint in occupied territory. The morning shift change had brought a fresh wave of officers to the security detail, among them Officer Travis Keene, whose reputation preceded him like the shadow of something larger and more menacing than the man himself. To passengers, Keene appeared as the embodiment of professional law enforcement, 6 feet of pressed uniform, polished badge, and the kind of authoritative demeanor that suggested competence and integrity. His colleagues knew him as someone who consistently delivered results, whose arrest statistics outpaced most of his peers, whose ability to identify suspicious behavior had earned him commendations from supervisors who valued productivity over process. What they didn't know, what the carefully crafted professional facade concealed, were the whispered conversations in parking garages, the financial pressures that had driven a man with a badge into arrangements that would have horrified the taxpayers who funded his salary, and the systematic targeting of travelers whose skin color made them convenient scapegoats for crimes they never committed. Sergeant Alana Brooks emerged from the jetway with the measured stride of someone accustomed to military precision, her posture straight despite the emotional weight she carried from her journey. She had spent the previous 3 days at Arlington National Cemetery, standing beside her father's grave on what would have been his 68th birthday, then enduring another round of appointments at the VA hospital where bureaucracy moved with the speed of continental drift and compassion seemed rationed like wartime supplies. At 32, Alana carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who had earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire, and who had returned home to find that her military service meant less in civilian airports than it had in combat zones. Her small carry-on bag contained the folded flag from her father's funeral, a few personal items, and the kind of meticulous organization that comes from years of living out of a footlocker. Her military duffel bag bore the faded patches of the 101st Airborne Division, and the newer were patterns that come from a veteran who still carried her service with pride. She had learned, through years of navigating a country that simultaneously honored and feared her uniform, to move through public spaces with careful awareness. She understood that her presence could trigger assumptions, that her military bearing sometimes intimidated rather than reassured, and that the intersection of her race and her service record created a complex dynamic that required constant navigation. What she couldn't have anticipated was that her careful dignity would make her a target rather than earning her the respect she had earned through blood and sacrifice. Meanwhile, in a restricted corridor accessible only to airport personnel, Travis Keene was finalizing arrangements that had been weeks in the making. Dario Dice Mendez moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had turned corruption into an art form, his designer luggage and expensive cologne masking the predatory nature of his business model. He had spent months identifying vulnerable airport employees, people with gambling debts, custody battles requiring expensive legal fees, medical emergencies that insurance wouldn't cover, and transforming their desperation into opportunity. Keene had initially resisted Mendez's overtures, his sense of professional ethics warring with the mounting bills from his ex-wife's attorney and the credit card statements that arrived like monthly reminders of his financial inadequacy. But Mendez understood the psychology of corruption, knew that resistance crumbled incrementally rather than all at once, and had patiently applied pressure until Keene's moral infrastructure collapsed under the weight of practical necessity. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. Mendez would provide packages that needed to bypass security screening. Keene would ensure those packages reached their destinations without interference from law enforcement, and both men would profit from a system that exploited the very security measures designed to protect innocent travelers. What made the scheme particularly insidious was its reliance on racial profiling. Keene's targets were almost exclusively black and brown travelers whose complaints would be dismissed as playing the race card, whose word would carry less weight than a uniformed officer's testimony, and whose arrests would be celebrated rather than questioned by supervisors eager to demonstrate their commitment to airport security. The handoff had been scheduled for 2:47 p.m., precisely timed to coincide with the afternoon shift change when attention would be focused on briefings rather than corridor monitoring. Keene approached the designated meeting point with the casual confidence of someone conducting routine business, his body language projecting the kind of professional focus that made him invisible to surveillance systems monitored by operators who saw hundreds of uniformed personnel moving through restricted areas every day. Mendez emerged from behind a maintenance cart with a black carry bag that represented both their salvation and their damnation, its exterior designed to blend seamlessly with the thousands of pieces of luggage that moved through the airport daily. The bag's contents, carefully packaged contraband worth more than Keene's annual salary, would normally have triggered every alarm in the security system, but the plan accounted for such obstacles by ensuring the bag would never encounter legitimate screening. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, a practiced choreography that spoke to previous successful operations and the kind of familiarity that develops between criminal partners. Keene accepted the bag with the same professional demeanor he brought to legitimate police work, his mind already focused on the route that would carry him past security checkpoints where his badge served as an all-access pass to areas most travelers would never see. But as Keene made his way toward the passenger areas where he would complete the final phase of the operation, the airport's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that transformed routine into crisis in the space of a single sentence. Attention all TSA personnel and airport security. Implement immediate random K9 sweeps at all checkpoints. Supervisor authorization required for all bag escorts. Repeat, random K9 sweeps now in effect. The words hit Keene like a physical blow, his practiced composure cracking as the implications cascaded through his consciousness. The German shepherds whose sensitive noses could detect contraband through multiple layers of concealment were already being deployed to positions that would make his planned route impossible. The supervisor authorization requirement meant that his movements would be scrutinized, documented, and potentially questioned by personnel who might notice inconsistencies in his story. Years of successful operations had bred a dangerous complacency, a sense that his badge provided immunity from the kind of scrutiny that trapped civilian criminals. The announcement shattered that illusion with the brutal efficiency of reality asserting itself over wishful thinking, leaving him standing in a crowded terminal with evidence that could destroy his career, his freedom, and his life clutched in his trembling hands. The bag seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, its presence transforming from an asset into a liability that required immediate disposal. But Keene's criminal experience had taught him that disposal meant destruction of evidence, and destroying evidence meant explaining its absence to partners who didn't accept losses with understanding or forgiveness. The only solution was to transfer the liability to someone else, to find a convenient scapegoat who would absorb the consequences while he maintained plausible deniability. His eyes swept the terminal with predatory focus, cataloging possibilities and rejecting options with the calculated efficiency of someone whose survival depended on making the right choice under pressure. Families with children generated too much attention when separated. Business travelers often had colleagues who might ask questions. Elderly passengers sometimes had medical conditions that complicated arrests. But single travelers, particularly those whose demographic profiles aligned with law enforcement stereotypes, offered opportunities that a desperate man could exploit. Sergeant Alana Brooks sat at gate C-23, her posture reflecting the patient discipline of someone accustomed to military hurry-up-and-wait protocols. Her military duffel bag rested beside her chair while her carry-on occupied the seat to her right, a configuration that spoke to both practical security awareness and the kind of systematic organization that characterized everything about her approach to travel. Keene studied her with the clinical detachment of a predator selecting prey, his trained eye noting details that would support the narrative he was already constructing. Solo black female traveler. Military bearing that some might interpret as potential aggression. Luggage configuration that could accommodate additional items without obvious detection. Most importantly, a demographic profile that aligned with the kind of arrest that enhanced rather than threatened a police officer's career. What happened next wasn't panic, it was the calculated execution of a plan that had been rehearsed in theoretical form during previous operations, refined through experience with racial profiling, and implemented with the kind of clinical precision that made it almost impossible to detect. Keene approached the seating area with the casual authority of someone conducting routine security business, his movements generating no more attention than any other uniformed officer navigating the terminal. The bag transfer occurred during a moment of perfect choreography. Alana had risen to check the departure board while passengers around her focused on their phones, their meals, and their private conversations. Keene's hands moved with practiced efficiency, sliding the black carry bag among her belongings with movements so smooth and natural that even direct observation might have interpreted them as helpful assistance from security personnel. But not everyone was distracted. Not everyone missed the significance of what had just transpired. And not everyone was willing to remain silent when they witnessed injustice in action. Malik Carter had learned to notice things that other people missed, a survival skill developed through 15 years of navigating a world where the difference between safety and danger often hinged on reading subtle cues that adults either ignored or misinterpreted. Sitting 3 rows behind Alana Brooks, ostensibly focused on the tournament brackets he was reviewing on his tablet, Malik had been unconsciously cataloging the movements of airport security personnel with the hypervigilance that comes from growing up in communities where police interactions could escalate without warning. His Aunt Keisha dozed in the seat beside him, exhausted from her double shift at the hospital and the early morning drive that had brought them to the airport in time for Malik's flight to the national debate tournament. She had sacrificed vacation days and overtime pay to support her nephew's academic achievements, understanding that opportunities like this could change the trajectory of a young black man's life in ways that transcended any single competition. Malik possessed the kind of intellectual curiosity that made him simultaneously an outstanding student and an exhausting nephew, his questions probing deeper than most adults found comfortable, his observations revealing contradictions that others preferred to ignore. His teachers praised his analytical skills while sometimes wishing he would apply them with less intensity to subjects that made classroom discussions uncomfortable. The incident that had shaped his perspective on law enforcement had occurred 3 years earlier, when his older brother Jalen had been arrested outside their apartment complex on charges that were later dismissed for lack of evidence. Malik had watched through their living room window as officers who had already decided Jalen's guilt forced him into handcuffs while neighbors recorded everything on their phones and his mother screamed for justice that never came. The charges were eventually dropped, but the damage persisted in the form of Jalen's shattered trust in institutional fairness, the family's legal bills that stretched their budget for months afterward, and Malik's growing understanding that the justice system operated according to rules that weren't written in any textbook. He had promised himself that day, with the fierce intensity that only teenagers can bring to moral commitments, that if he ever witnessed such injustice again, he would not remain silent regardless of the personal cost. So when Officer Keene approached the seating area with movements that triggered Malik's subliminal alarm system, the teenager's attention focused with laser-like intensity on details that other passengers ignored. He watched the officer's eyes scan the crowd with predatory focus. He noticed the way Keene's hand movements suggested concealment rather than assistance. Most importantly, he saw the exact moment when the black carry bag was transferred from the officer's possession to the space around Alana's belongings. The realization hit Malik like a physical blow, his heart rate accelerating as the implications cascaded through his consciousness. He was witnessing the kind of systematic corruption that destroyed lives, the deliberate framing of an innocent person by someone whose badge should have made him a protector rather than a predator. Everything about the interaction screamed premeditation, from the officer's careful timing to his strategic positioning that minimized the likelihood of detection. Malik's first instinct was to alert his aunt, but Keisha's exhaustion and their precarious position as travelers who couldn't afford to miss their flight created complications that a 15-year-old mind struggled to navigate. When he whispered his observations, her response reflected the kind of protective pragmatism that had kept their family safe through decades of institutional encounters. "Baby, stay out of it. Whatever you think you saw, it's not our business. We can't miss this flight." But watching Alana Brooks being separated from her belongings by officers whose demeanor suggested predetermined guilt rather than investigative curiosity, Malik felt the weight of his promise pressing against his consciousness like a physical force. This woman, this veteran whose military bearing reminded him of his grandfather's stories about service and sacrifice, was about to become the victim of the same systemic targeting that had traumatized his brother and countless others. The moral arithmetic was brutal in its clarity. Remaining silent would preserve his safety while enabling injustice. Speaking up would risk retaliation while potentially saving an innocent person from destruction. For most people, such calculations might have favored self-preservation. But Malik Carter had been raised by a family that understood the cost of silence, that had taught him to measure courage not by the absence of fear but by the willingness to act despite its presence. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. If Bold Black Watch TV moved you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us amplify Black stories about justice that deserve to be heard. The transformation of Sergeant Alana Brooks from respected passenger to suspected criminal occurred with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that characterized modern law enforcement at its worst. A seamless transition from presumption of innocence to assumption of guilt that required no evidence beyond the color of her skin and the presence of contraband that had materialized through calculated deception. Officer Keene approached with the professional demeanor that had served him well throughout his career, his voice carrying the tone of respectful authority that suggested legitimate law enforcement business rather than the orchestrated corruption that was actually unfolding. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to speak with you for a moment. Just routine security verification." The words were carefully chosen to project normalcy while establishing control, the kind of language that had been refined through years of practice and departmental training designed to minimize resistance while maximizing compliance. Alana responded with the automatic respect that military service had ingrained in her interactions with authority figures, gathering her belongings and preparing to cooperate with what she assumed was standard airport security protocol. But the dynamics shifted with alarming speed as additional officers appeared from positions throughout the terminal, their coordinated movements suggesting a planned operation rather than spontaneous response. The casual conversation tone evaporated, replaced by the kind of aggressive authority that treated compliance as suspicious and resistance as confirmation of guilt. "We're going to need to examine your luggage," announced Sergeant Rodriguez, whose arrival had elevated the encounter from routine inquiry to formal investigation. "Step away from your bags and keep your hands visible." Alana's military training had prepared her for hostile environments and unexpected threats, but nothing in her experience had equipped her to navigate the surreal experience of being treated like an enemy combatant in an American airport. Her Bronze Star for valor under fire seemed meaningless in the face of officers whose body language suggested she represented a threat requiring immediate containment. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice maintaining the disciplined calm that had carried her through combat situations where panic meant death. "I'm a veteran returning from a VA appointment. I don't understand what's happening." The mention of her military service should have prompted additional verification, perhaps a review of her identification or a conversation about her service record. Instead, it seemed to trigger increased suspicion from officers whose worldview didn't accommodate the possibility that veterans could also be dangerous criminals, that military training might enhance rather than diminish criminal capability. Officer Keene moved toward her luggage with theatrical authority, his movements designed to project the kind of professional competence that would look impressive on body camera footage and courtroom testimony. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe you may be carrying prohibited items. We're going to conduct a thorough search." The black carry bag sat among her belongings like a cancer waiting to be discovered, its presence transforming the entire encounter from investigation to foregone conclusion. When Keene's hands closed around it with the kind of surprised discovery that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't witnessed the planting operation, the theatrical performance reached its climactic moment. "Well, what do we have here?" The words carried the tone of professional vindication, as if careful police work had uncovered criminal activity rather than systematic corruption creating the evidence it pretended to discover. The bag opened to reveal packages that had been carefully prepared to resemble the kind of contraband that justified federal charges and enhanced sentences. Alana's reaction was pure, unfiltered shock, the kind of genuine surprise that couldn't be manufactured or concealed, her military composure cracking under the weight of accusations that made no sense in any universe governed by logic or justice. "That's not mine. I've never seen that bag before in my life. This is impossible." But her protest seemed to confirm rather than challenge the officer's predetermined narrative, her denial interpreted as the predictable response of someone caught in criminal activity. The psychological dynamics of racial profiling kicked into high gear, transforming her military bearing into potential aggression, her articulate speech into educated arrogance, her obvious confusion into calculated deception. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," Officer Rodriguez commanded, his hand moving instinctively toward equipment that could escalate the encounter from verbal to physical confrontation. "Fighting us isn't going to help your situation." The body camera that should have provided objective documentation of police conduct had been activated with suspicious timing, beginning its recording after the crucial planting operation but capturing the discovery phase with high-definition clarity. The footage would show a professional law enforcement operation uncovering criminal activity, edited by omission to exclude the corruption that had created the entire scenario. It was in this moment of maximum desperation, when the machinery of injustice seemed to operate with unstoppable momentum, that Alana's voice rose above the chaos with words that would later be quoted in federal court filings and civil rights documentation. "I served this country. I buried friends under its flag. And you're doing this to me?" The emotional power of her statement created a moment of uncomfortable silence among officers whose professional detachment required them to ignore the humanity of their targets, whose operational efficiency depended on viewing suspects as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. But in an airport filled with travelers whose phones could document everything, such moments of truth couldn't be suppressed indefinitely. The weight of witnessed injustice pressed against Malik Carter's consciousness with increasing intensity as he watched the systematic destruction of Sergeant Alana Brooks unfold with bureaucratic precision, each procedural step carrying her further from presumption of innocence toward predetermined guilt. His hands trembled as he gripped his tablet, his academic mind processing the legal and moral implications of remaining silent while his teenage heart screamed for action that could change everything or destroy his future. The decision crystallized in the space between heartbeats, moral clarity cutting through practical concerns with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from understanding that some moments define the trajectory of an entire life. Standing on legs that shook with nervous energy and determined courage, Malik Carter stepped into the spotlight of institutional power with words that would reverberate through federal courtrooms and civil rights histories. "That officer put the bag there." His voice cracked with the strain of adolescent vocal cords delivering adult accusations, but the words carried the unmistakable ring of truth that cuts through layers of professional deception and bureaucratic obfuscation. "I saw him planted in her luggage. He's lying." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, a cascade of adult attention focused on a teenager whose accusations threatened to unravel carefully constructed narratives and expose corruption that could destroy careers. Officer Keene's professional composure cracked like ice under pressure, his predatory confidence replaced by the desperate calculations of someone whose carefully planned operation was collapsing in real time. "Kid, you don't know what you saw," Keene responded, his voice carrying undertones of threat that transformed professional authority into something more sinister and personal. "These situations are complicated. You should stay out of things that don't concern you." But Malik had spent years studying the rhetoric of intimidation, understanding how power structures use doubt and fear to silence voices that threaten their operations. His debate team experience had taught him to recognize logical fallacies and emotional manipulation, skills that served him well as he faced down an adult whose badge represented institutional authority but whose actions embodied systematic corruption. "I know exactly what I saw," Malik replied, his voice gaining strength with each word as teenage idealism reinforced by academic training confronted corrupt authority. "You approached her seats when she wasn't there. You put that bag with her luggage. You planned this." The accumulating attention of passengers whose phones were now documenting every word created a pressure cooker environment where truth and falsehood would be tested in the crucible of public scrutiny. Airport security supervisors who had initially dismissed teenage claims as misunderstanding or attention-seeking began to recognize the potential implications of ignoring accusations that could expose systematic corruption within their operations. Aunt Keisha, jolted from exhausted sleep by the commotion surrounding her nephew, found herself caught between protective instincts that demanded retreat and growing recognition that Malik's accusations carried the weight of moral necessity. Her years of navigating institutional encounters had taught her to avoid confrontations that could escalate beyond control, but watching her nephew demonstrate courage that she had always hoped he possessed created an obligation to support rather than silence him. "Show me what the cameras recorded," Malik demanded with the confident authority of someone whose academic achievements had taught him to challenge unsupported assertions and demand evidence for extraordinary claims. "If I'm wrong, the footage will prove it. If I'm right, everyone will see what really happened." The request for video review represented the moment when theoretical corruption encountered practical accountability, when systematic deception faced technological documentation that couldn't be intimidated or silenced. Airport manager Patricia Holloway, whose career had been built on crisis management and diplomatic resolution of conflicts that threatened operational efficiency, recognized that this confrontation had escalated beyond standard passenger disputes into territory that required immediate and careful handling. The tension in Terminal C became palpable as security personnel, TSA supervisors, and administrative officials gathered around monitor stations that could either vindicate professional law enforcement or expose corruption that would trigger federal investigations. Alana Brooks stood in handcuffs that represented presumed guilt while Malik Carter's accusations hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall on careers built on systematic deception. Bold Black Watch TV is more than a channel, it's a community. Subscribe, like this video, and join us as we celebrate justice, truth, culture, and powerful Black narratives. The CCTV footage began with the routine documentation of airport operations. Passengers moving through terminals with the predictable patterns of people focused on reaching destinations rather than observing the machinery of institutional power that surrounded them. But as the timestamp approached the crucial moment that Malik had witnessed, the images on the screen began to tell a story that contradicted official narratives and confirmed teenage testimony with devastating clarity. There was Officer Keene, moving through restricted areas with the casual authority of someone conducting legitimate business. There was the meeting with Dario Mendez, captured in high-definition detail that documented the transfer of contraband with bureaucratic precision. Most damning of all, there was the approach to Alana's seating area and the careful placement of the black carry bag among her belongings, recorded with the kind of technological clarity that made denial impossible and prosecution inevitable. The silence that followed the video review was deafening, broken only by the ambient noise of airport operations and the collective intake of breath from officials whose careers had just been redefined by pixels on a screen. Officer Keene's face cycled through expressions of shock, denial, desperation, and finally, the hollow recognition that his carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. The reversal of fortune occurred with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized Alana's initial targeting, but now the machinery of institutional power operated in service of truth rather than corruption, switching targets from innocent veteran to corrupt officer with the mechanical precision of systems designed to protect rather than exploit. Officer Keene's attempts to seize control of the evidence revealed the desperation of someone whose criminal experience had never prepared him for exposure in such a public and technologically documented environment. His movements toward the computer terminal were intercepted by supervisors whose duty to protect institutional integrity outweighed any loyalty to individual officers, particularly those whose actions threatened to expose systematic problems within airport security operations. "Step away from the equipment, Officer Keene," commanded Chief Security Supervisor Williams, whose 30-year career in law enforcement had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate police work and criminal activity conducted under the protection of official authority. "You're being relieved of duty pending immediate investigation." The transformation of predator into prey occurred with stunning rapidity, Keene's badge and weapon confiscated with the same professional efficiency he had once brought to targeting innocent travelers. His desperate attempts at explanation, claims of misunderstanding, suggestions of camera malfunctions, appeals to professional solidarity, fell on ears that had heard similar deflections from criminals whose only mistake had been getting caught. Dario Mendez's attempt to escape through the terminal chaos provided additional drama as K-9 units that had originally threatened Keene's operation now served justice by tracking the trafficker whose corruption had initiated the entire criminal enterprise. His capture in Gate A-15 added federal trafficking charges to a case that was rapidly expanding beyond simple evidence, planting into territory that would interest prosecutors at the highest levels of law enforcement. For Alana Brooks, vindication came with a bitter taste of recognition that justice delayed carried its own traumatic weight, that clearing her name couldn't erase the memory of handcuffs and accusations, couldn't restore the dignity that had been systematically stripped away by officers whose duty should have been her protection. The apologies offered by supervisors carried the hollow ring of institutional damage control rather than genuine recognition of the harm that had been inflicted. But liberation from immediate legal jeopardy provided the foundation for longer-term accountability through civil litigation that would expose the systematic nature of racial targeting within airport security operations. Attorney Jasmine Washington, whose practice specialized in civil rights violations by law enforcement, recognized that Alana's case represented an opportunity to challenge institutional practices rather than simply seeking individual compensation. The federal lawsuit that followed would document a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that extended far beyond Officer Keene's individual corruption, revealing training deficiencies, supervisory failures, and institutional cultures that enabled rather than prevented racial profiling. Malik Carter's testimony would provide the crucial eyewitness account that transformed accusations into convictions, his courage under pressure serving as the foundation for systemic reform. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV for more powerful black stories. Keene's career destruction unfolded with the methodical precision of institutional accountability finally applied to someone whose badge had previously provided immunity from consequences. His termination, pension forfeiture, and criminal prosecution served notice that corruption within law enforcement would face consequences when exposed by technological evidence and citizen courage. The ripple effects extended throughout the airport security system, triggering policy reviews, training modifications, and supervisory protocols designed to prevent similar incidents. But for the individuals whose lives had been forever changed by those crucial moments in Terminal C, institutional reforms provided cold comfort compared to the personal costs of surviving systematic injustice. Standing in the same terminal where she had been falsely accused and publicly humiliated, Alana Brooks faced Malik Carter with emotions that transcended simple gratitude, recognizing in this remarkable teenager the kind of moral courage that military service had taught her to value above all other virtues. "You saved me," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose faith in justice had been restored by the actions of a 15-year-old who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Malik's response reflected the maturity that had driven his decision to speak truth to power despite personal risk. "No. I just told the truth. That's what we're supposed to do." The profound simplicity of his words captured the essential moral framework that had guided his actions. Not heroism or dramatic gestures, but the basic commitment to truth-telling that forms the foundation of any just society. In a world where complexity often obscures moral clarity, where institutional power can overwhelm individual conscience, the teenage witness had demonstrated that courage sometimes requires nothing more than saying what you saw and refusing to be silenced by threats or intimidation. The final image that would remain in the minds of everyone who witnessed these events was not the corruption that had initiated the crisis or the institutional failures that had enabled it, but the moment when moral courage triumphed over systematic oppression through the simple act of bearing witness to truth. In the end, the bag that Officer Travis Keene had intended to destroy Sergeant Alana Brooks's life became the instrument of his own destruction. The evidence that exposed corruption became the foundation for justice, and the teenager whose voice cracked with nervous energy became the catalyst for accountability that reached far beyond a single airport terminal. In the end, the bag didn't destroy Alana's life, it destroyed the man who planted it. But perhaps the most important truth revealed by these events was simpler and more powerful than any legal outcome or institutional reform. In a world where systematic injustice operates through silence and complicity, the courage to speak the truth can still change everything.